Ashley and I had been together for 10 years, and after getting married 3 years ago, we finally bought a house in a small inland town called Athens, Georgia. It was a dream come true. The house sat on a big plot of land, right in front of a patch of woods that stretched far beyond what we could see. It felt perfect, the kind of place we always imagined starting a family in, with space to adopt a dog and let the kids we hoped to have run around. It checked every box. The first few days in the house were uneventful. We spent the weekend unpacking, filling the empty rooms with our life, and enjoying the quietness of our new neighborhood. Everything seemed ideal, like we were finally settling into the life we'd worked so hard to build. But Monday night, things started to get strange. It was around 11 p.m., just after we had turned off the lights and settled into bed. Out of nowhere, music began playing from the backyard. It wasn't party music or anything remotely modern. It sounded old, vintage, like something from a record player that hadn't been touched in decades. At first we thought it might have been a neighbor, but our closest ones were far enough away that it seemed impossible for the sound to carry like that. This music, though, was definitely coming from our yard. I remember looking at Ashley, and the same confused, slightly unnerved expression was on her face. We were still learning the house and the neighborhood, so maybe this was some kind of weird welcome tradition. I opened the window beside the bed to get a better listen. That's when the song became clear, eerily clear. It was a staticky version of Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf by Henry Hall, a song from the 1930s. Even though it was supposed to be a playful, happy tune, hearing it echoing from the woods behind our house in the dead of night made my skin crawl. Something about it felt wrong. The music was distant, but at the same time, it felt like it was meant just for us. I shut the window and told Ashley it was probably some kids playing a prank, but deep down, neither of us believed that. I went downstairs, hoping to find a light switch that would flood the backyard with enough light to clear up whatever was happening. Maybe someone had set up a speaker or left something behind. But when I flicked the switch, nothing looked out of place. No figures hiding behind trees, no equipment to explain the source of the music. The backyard was still, bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. Yet, the eerie melody kept playing, growing louder as I stepped outside. And then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the yard at all. It was coming from the woods, that patch of dark, dense trees just beyond our property line. The song played out completely, fading into silence. And I stood there, surrounded by nothing but the quiet night and my racing thoughts. My brain struggled to find a logical explanation. I convinced myself it had to be a prank, maybe some local kids trying to freak out the new people in town. But even as I said it out loud to Ashley when I went back upstairs, I knew it didn't make sense. Why would anyone go to such lengths to mess with us, especially with something so bizarre? The next night, things only got worse. It was late again, and we had just turned off the lights, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. But then, like clockwork, the music started. Only this time, it was different. It wasn't the old staticky tune from the night before, Uritai. This time, it was Tiptoe Through the Tulips. And it was asterisk, loud asterisk, so loud it rattled the windows. My heart pounded as Ashley and I sat up in bed, staring at each other in shock. The song, already unsettling in its own way, blared through the night, seeping into every corner of the house. Something was seriously wrong. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I jumped out of bed and went to the window. That's when I saw it. Something small in the grass near the edge of the woods. It wasn't a person, but it was definitely something. My pulse quickened as I turned to Ashley. "I'm going out there," I said before she could stop me. She wanted to call the cops. I should have listened. But in that moment, I felt like I had to do something. I couldn't let whoever or whatever was behind this think they could scare us away. With adrenaline pumping through my veins, I marched outside. The music was louder than ever, filling the yard with its creepy, distorted notes. I walked toward the object in the grass, and as I got closer, I realized it was an old, beat-up radio, the kind you'd find in an antique store, dusty and forgotten. I reached down, picked it up, and switched it off. The music died instantly, leaving behind a deafening silence. I looked up at Ashley, who was still watching me from the window, and held the radio up to show her. Before I could say anything, she screamed, "Run!" The urgency in her voice made my blood freeze. "Why?" I yelled back. "There's people standing behind you." Panic flooded me as I turned around. My heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the woods, were 3 shadowy figures standing perfectly still. They weren't moving, weren't saying anything. Just standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were too close for comfort. Just a few feet away from where I stood, I didn't hesitate. I dropped the radio, spun around, and bolted for the house, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible. As I ran, I could feel the weight of their gaze on my back, like they were daring me to look again. I didn't. I wasn't going to risk it. I slammed the door behind me, locking it instantly. Ashley was already upstairs, crying, terrified. I froze in place, my mind racing. Ashley's scream echoed in my ears as I slowly turned, dread building in my chest. At the edge of the woods, barely visible in the moonlight, stood 3 figures. They weren't moving, just standing there, spaced apart like some kind of eerie formation. The darkness cloaked their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching in complete silence. Fear wrapped around me like a noose. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. For a split second, all I could do was stare back at them, the air between us thick with something unexplainable. Then the fear took over, and I turned on my heel and sprinted back to the house. The door slammed behind me with a force that shook the walls, and I locked it, chest heaving, my pulse pounding in my ears. Upstairs, Ashley was sobbing uncontrollably, barely able to speak through her tears. I called the cops, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. My hands shook as I hung up, the silence of the house broken only by Ashley's quiet sobs. I kept my eyes on the windows, half expecting to see those figures approaching the house, but everything outside was still. Too still. When the police arrived, they took the old radio as evidence, asking me to walk them through what had happened. I led them to the spot where I'd seen the figures, but they were gone. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone being there at all. The woods looked just as they always had. Dark and empty, as if nothing had ever disturbed them. One of the officers gave us a reassuring nod, saying they'd keep an eye on the area. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The police left, and Ashley and I were alone again. Despite their patrols, the house felt more exposed, more vulnerable than ever. Every creak, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. I kept expecting to hear the music again, or worse, to see those figures standing just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. That night, neither of us slept. We lay in bed, wide-eyed, listening for any sign of movement. Hours passed in tense silence, but the figures didn't return. Not yet. It's been a few weeks since that night, and nothing has happened since. No more music, no more radios, and no shadowy figures standing at the edge of the woods. But every time I look out the window, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to come back. I don't know what they wanted or why they targeted us, but next time, if there is a next time, I'll be ready. After living with my parents for 26 years, buying my first house was both thrilling and unsettling. It was June of 2021, and the adjustment to being on my own was more jarring than I expected. My new place wasn't too far, just a 30-minute drive from my parents' house, so I figured I could handle the change. What I was really looking forward to was the peace and quiet. My dad's constant late-night trips up and down the stairs, thanks to his chronic insomnia, had been a lifelong source of frustration. I'd finally have a chance to sleep through the night. At least, that's what I thought. The house itself was perfect for me. 3 floors, plenty of space. The basement was unfinished and mainly for laundry and storage, but the first floor had all the living spaces. And upstairs there were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. I turned one room into an office, another into a small workout area, and the last was my bedroom. My dad helped me move in, setting up furniture and giving the place that final touch only a parent can provide. By the end of the first week, I had everything unpacked and arranged. It felt like home, or at least I thought it did. One Sunday night, I knew sleep wasn't going to come easily. I was restless, wide awake with that unsettling feeling of too much energy at the wrong time, hoping to knock myself out. I popped a melatonin in a sleeping pill, and soon enough, I was drifting off into a heavy, dream-filled sleep. It worked perfectly until something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. My head was still foggy from the dream I'd just snapped out of, and the room felt off. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Someone was going up the stairs. In my half-asleep state, my brain automatically linked the sound to my dad. For as long as I could remember, his insomnia had filled our old house with the noise of his late-night pacing. It was so familiar, I almost ignored it. But as the fog in my mind lifted, dread began to creep in. I wasn't living with my dad anymore. I was alone. I sat up in bed, heart thudding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Maybe it was a leftover from a dream, some kind of auditory hallucination, I told myself. But it felt too real, too clear. My pulse raced as I nervously called out, "Dad?" My voice sounded shaky, foreign. No answer. I swung my legs out of bed, the floor cold beneath my feet, and flipped on the light. I could feel the panic rising in my throat as I cautiously stepped into the hallway. Each room I passed was empty, everything in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked to the top of the stairs, gripping the banister, and looked down. At the bottom of the stairs, a tall man stood, staring up at me. He was wearing a mask, his features completely hidden, and for a second my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It didn't feel real, like I was still trapped in some half-lucid nightmare. But the longer I stared, the more the icy grip of fear squeezed my chest. This wasn't a dream. There was someone in my house. I froze. For a moment, it felt like I was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. Like this couldn't actually be happening to me. The masked man stood there, completely still, just staring up at me. He didn't have a weapon, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to confront him. I felt the fear twisting in my gut as I found my voice and screamed. The words came out shaky, but somehow they worked. To my shock, the man turned around without a word and calmly walked out the front door, as if this was all perfectly normal. For a split second, I just stood there, my brain struggling to keep up. Then adrenaline kicked in. I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears, and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. Just as I tried to catch my breath, I heard it. The back door slammed. There was another person. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and frantically called my dad. He picked up instantly, probably wide awake, as usual. "There's someone in the house," I blurted out, barely able to get the words out. Instead of the comfort I expected, he scolded me. "Why are you calling me? Call the police." I hung up and immediately dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator asked a million questions. Was I safe? Where was I? Could I describe the intruders? I could barely think straight. By the time the police arrived, I had calmed down just enough to explain what happened, but I didn't have much to offer. All I could tell them was that one of them was tall and wore a mask. I hadn't even thought to watch where they went or what kind of car they might have used. After inspecting the house, the police pointed out the entry point, a small kitchen window that I hadn't even realized was big enough for someone to climb through. To my surprise, it didn't seem like they had stolen anything. No electronics were missing, no drawers rifled through. It was almost like they had just come in to be there. The officers reassured me, but the damage was done. Experiencing a home invasion was something I thought only happened in news stories, to strangers, not to me, and definitely not right after moving into my first house. Now, every night, I sleep with a knife next to my bed. When I first moved into my house by the canal, it felt like a dream come true. The neighbors on both sides introduced themselves right away, friendly and welcoming, and the waterfront was perfect for my boat. I'd always wanted a place like this, quiet, with the added bonus of keeping my boat docked just outside my backyard. The only thing that bothered me, even from the start, was the house directly across the canal. It was old, neglected, and kind of ruined the view. The windows were dark every night, and the place had an eerie, empty feeling to it, like no one had lived there in a long time. For nearly 2 weeks, I convinced myself it was abandoned, that no one would live in a place like that. But one night, just as I was about to close my blinds, something caught my eye. A light was on in the house, across the canal, the first time I'd seen it illuminated. I squinted through the darkness, trying to make out what was inside. And that's when I saw him. A man stood in the window, his figure barely lit by the dim glow of a single lamp. He was staring straight at my house. For a moment I froze, unsure if he could actually see me or if he was just looking outside. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became that he was staring right at me. Trying to shake off the weirdness of the moment, I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was looking out into his own yard. Maybe he didn't even know I was there. Still, something about it unsettled me. I quickly shut the blinds and tried to forget about it. Over the next few days, I started seeing him more often. Each time, he stood by the back door of that decaying house across the canal, the dim light behind him casting long shadows. He didn't move, didn't make any gestures, just watched. The first few times, I tried to ignore it, but soon it became impossible to shake the feeling that his eyes were following my every move. I had some friends over one afternoon, and hoping a bit of company would ease my mind. We took the boat out, had a good time, but even when we were laughing and joking, I couldn't fully relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder at that house, even though I didn't see him that day. I felt his presence. It was as if his eyes were still there, lingering. That night, I stared out my bedroom window again. There he was, just standing at his back door, unmoving, watching. I turned off my light, hoping maybe in the darkness he'd stop. Maybe he wouldn't notice me anymore. But he didn't move. He just stood there for what felt like hours, his shadowy figure fixed on my house. The paranoia was getting to me. I avoided going outside at night, always feeling his gaze from across the canal. Even in the safety of my home, I felt exposed. Then, late one night, I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on my deck. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was creeping right outside my window. I rushed to the window, but from upstairs I couldn't see the deck. Before I could move, a sudden, deafening crash rang out from downstairs, the sound of shattering glass. I bolted out of bed, my heart racing as I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find. There, on the floor, was shattered glass from the back window. A brick lay in the middle of the mess, surrounded by sharp fragments. Whoever had thrown it was already gone. Shaking, I called 911, my mind racing back to the man from across the canal. It had to be him. I told the dispatcher everything about the man watching me for days, how he'd been staring at my house like a predator stalking prey. When the police arrived, I told them to go check the house across the canal. I was sure he was the one responsible. But when they came back, they told me no one was living there. The house had been foreclosed months ago. No utilities, no tenant. It was supposed to be completely empty. So, who was I seeing? Determined to figure out what was really going on, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next morning, after the cops left, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story. That house, across the canal. It didn't make sense. Someone had to be living there. Someone had been watching me. I needed answers. I crossed the small footbridge connecting the two sides of the canal and approached the rundown house. The front door was locked, as expected. But when I went around to the back, the door swung open without resistance. A cold draft hit me as I stepped inside, and instantly, I regretted it. The air was thick with a heavy, unnatural stillness, like the house was holding its breath. The inside was dark, except for thin slivers of light that seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Dust coated everything, from the floor to the countertops, untouched for what seemed like years. But as I moved through the empty rooms, something felt off. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, like the house itself was waiting for something. I reached the base of the stairs, and that's when I heard it. A creak from upstairs, slow and deliberate, followed by a faint rustling. My heart stopped. There was someone, or something, up there. For a split second, I considered going up to check, but a sudden wave of dread washed over me, and my instincts kicked in. I turned and bolted, running out the back door without looking back. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my own house, my chest heaving, adrenaline pumping through my veins. That day, I had security cameras installed, one by the front door and one overlooking the backyard. I wasn't taking any chances. The broken window was fixed, but the unease stuck with me. Every night I checked the camera feed, half expecting to see that man standing in his window, staring across the canal, but he never showed up again. The house remained dark, empty, just as the police had said. Weeks have passed, and things have been quiet. I haven't seen the man, haven't heard any strange noises at night, but I still wonder, who was he? Why had he been watching me? And where did he go? The house across the canal stands like a tomb now, lifeless and cold, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. I don't leave my blinds open at night anymore.